All right. Welcome, everybody who may be joining in with us now. Assuming that you won't even hear this greeting since you're not logging on right now. But for those of you who may be watching it later, we're glad that you're joining us for week 5 of Micah study, in which we hear all about doom and gloom, then all about hope, then some doom and gloom, and then hope, and it just keeps cycling back and forth. Between, I guess, the ideal and reality, I suppose, is what's going on. So as you join in, if you could comment who you are, and if you're not a Creekwood member, we'd love for you to tell us where you're tuning in from. Keri Lynn's on a remote location today. Where are you joining us from?
So I'm in Brownwood, Texas. My folks have a lake house up here. So I have officially run away from my responsibilities.
Everyone feel real bad for Keri Lynn right now that she's quarantined there instead of back in good old Dallas.
So much sympathy. I'm sure I will get.
Well, I feel like you being stuck in your apartment for without a yard or anything for so long, this is you deserve this.
Thanks. It's good to just be. This is the house that we've gone to for years. Thanks, Patrick. My brother's sitting at the same table commenting along, so this will be great.
Awesome.
No, this is it's fine. No, so this is like our childhood home. Both my parents have sold the houses that I spent the majority of my time in, and so this house feels it's like going home for me. So you'll see in the background, so my mom's maiden name is Campbell. So the entire kitchen of this house is decorated with Campbell's soup memorabilia. So I win for new best background.
I feel like this is a rural Texas version of Andy Warhol.
100. I mean, I'm gonna make everybody nauseous for a second and show you behind me is all of the crazy memorabilia, and it just continues from there. So it's a total lake house, but we love it. So
well, yeah. So Laura, Brian, Keri Dawn, sorry, not Keri Lynn. Julian, Randy, Steve, we're glad you are here joining us. And Patrick, of course, we are glad you are at the same table as your sister right now. For all the other people joining us, please go ahead and comment that you're here. We always love to know who we're talking to and who's commenting along. So I hope everyone is doing all right. I would say that I read an article today on how quarantine fatigue is a real thing. I probably should have already known.
Oh, I saw that.
Yeah, I probably should have already known that was a real thing by 2 months now. So some days we hit it and some days we don't. But today's been a good day. So we actually we just got done a little bit ago. Kendall Simpson is running soccer practices for her little girls team, and they're more boot camp than soccer practice. So we've made this a family activity on Monday and Wednesday, and I usually come in here with my legs feeling like Jell-O.
It's good. I've seen those workouts. They look like a whole other thing.
I mean, she's got third graders doing burpees and leapfrogs and ab work and all sorts of stuff.
That's incredible. Shout out to Kendall Simpson.
Absolutely.
Listen, those soccer games are no joke. It is. I admire the 7-year-olds that can run faster and harder and jump farther than I can.
So Laura, the Bible study mascot was just meowing outside the door. They may be. We had a dog. We were keeping my father-in-law's dog for the last 4 days. So Monkey got the upstairs, and Lizzie the dog got the downstairs. And Lizzie may be gloating that he won, and the dog got kicked out because they actually moved to Florida today. So. You went to a lake house. My father-in-law is going to the beach. I'm just here. So I gotta see. I think Monkey's out.
You're just surrounded by people. And there he goes to get Bible study mascot.
Oh no!
Oh my goodness! Oh, fake news.
Nope, fake news. I think Monkey ran away. All right. So, all right, everyone. Thanks for joining in. We can get started tonight. And I know people have been joining in at all different times. So we can get started if you got your Bibles open. We are in Micah chapter 5. And if you are new with us this week, we covered 1 through 4 the last 4 weeks. And Keri Lynn got to lead chapter 4, which was all the good news. Although we did get into some pretty heavy conversation associated with all that good news. And if you are new with us, we always love for you to comment along. This is kind of seminary level stuff that you're getting here each Wednesday night, and we're proud that you are all tuning in for it. So, and the way we do this is we read along and we stop at various points. Keri Lynn and I have exchanged notes, or at least I sent her notes today.
I read them.
You read them, so that's exchanging. As we go along. So we'll stop and we'll talk about some stuff, and we're going to ask questions, and we hope that you will always comment along. So let's start with chapter 5, and to give an overview of what's going on so far, if you are new or forgot or had other things to think about throughout the last 7 days. Micah is this prophet from outside of Jerusalem, about 37 kilometers outside of Jerusalem, southwest of Jerusalem, and is speaking truth into, because one of the points we've been trying to make is that when you're reading a prophetic book in the Old Testament, you are not reading a fortune telling about what's going to happen. You're reading God's word and God's truth for the current situation and telling the truth about what will happen because of what they've done, as well as the truth about how God is still with them. Because I don't think, outside of Obadiah and Nahum, which are prophetic books that really celebrate the way that Israel kicked everyone's tail, most of them, all the doom and gloom prophets, always have elements of a remnant, right? Am I right about that? There's no other, yeah.
Yes, I don't know. I feel like I'm gonna get an email now where I made a definitive statement. It was wrong.
Someone's gonna go.
Probably. Let's go with that.
Yeah, someone's gonna go research it just for fun. It's gonna be Randy and Julie Jones. I have a feeling.
100%. That would be accurate. Which they just texted me. They're getting a puppy, so.
Oh, nice.
The whole internet needs to know that now. And it's a really cute puppy, and they just sent me a video of it too. So congratulations.
Way to go, Randy and Julie. That's a cute puppy. All right. So the prophet, the truth he's speaking and the situation he's speaking into is it's a little twofold, because if you weren't aware, the Bible for many of the books was written or copied or recorded. And then later on, what people would do is they would find truth in that book, kind of like we do, and they would add their own little addendums because it fit with the time. So he's mostly speaking about the Assyrians who are attacking the northern kingdom of Israel, or already have conquered the northern kingdom of Israel and are bearing down on the southern kingdom of Judah. But there's also lots of mentions in there about the Babylonian exile, which is not the Assyrians, it's the Babylonians. And that's why we know there are multiple writers, because they're just two different events. So we've got kind of that as the landscape for where Micah is proclaiming doom, because the leaders, religious leaders, political leaders, have basically extorted the poor people and taken advantage of the poor people, or middle class really even, to steal their land, steal their wealth. And when you only have a few people who can manage in a society, there is a 99% chance that any army is just going to come and take whatever you have. So they're under threat because they have run their society into the ground, not followed anything in the book of Deuteronomy as it should be. And if you're really interested in the book of Deuteronomy, Keri Lynn ought to lead a master class on that.
The book of Deuteronomy. It's so great.
It really is. The book of Deuteronomy to me is really it's the book of law for when they're going to go into they're going to cross the river and settle in this area of the promised land. But it's so interesting because we always think of the Old Testament as this really like mean law that holds us back from everything. And in reality, I read Deuteronomy and I find so much freedom from like oppression or hatred, or like it's meant to uplift everybody. So it's kind of an interesting thing. Oh, there is Monkey. So dwell on the landscape of Micah chapter 5. If you want to talk any more about Deuteronomy, I'm going to go let Monkey in.
Yeah, I think just another important point to make about Deuteronomy, and like we've been saying,
Hey.
Monkey's just reminding you who really runs the house.
Oh yeah, for sure. Monkey wants to make sure that nobody misses his cameo for Bible study.
No, what I was saying about Deuteronomy, I think it shows us that stuff in the Old Testament that appears in the New Testament, a lot of Deuteronomy shows up in Jesus quotes from Deuteronomy the most out of any other Hebrew Bible or Old Testament text. And so today we're going to talk about a couple of New Testament concepts that are appearing here and how we use the whole story of Scripture, right? We use what God has for us throughout this entirety. And so that's another thing why I'm so passionate and I love Deuteronomy as much as I do, because I think it shows us from the very beginning there's this plan and there's this love and there's this grace, and all of that is further made apparent to us in Jesus. But it did not, like, grace didn't show up out of nowhere when Jesus came. Grace is there from the beginning, and grace is there in the law. And so yeah, that's my Deuteronomy spiel.
Yeah, I think so the opposite kind of theology is called either dispensational theology, or you could probably go with process theology a little bit too. Of like, process theology is God responds to our actions, and so we somewhat control what God does as God's trying to get back to plan A. Dispensational theology is that God decided that God was going to relate to us differently in throughout, so that's why Scripture is different. And I find dispensational theology abhorrent. And I'm sorry to anybody who's a dispensationalist who's watching this, but it just doesn't make sense to me. But so a dispensationalist person would say, well, God actually changed the way that God relates to us through Jesus versus the wrath of the Old Testament. And so I would read Deuteronomy and say it's impossible to say that because Deuteronomy is so filled with grace, the way that Jesus presents it. So anyway, yeah, that's a good. All right, so yeah, we're going to get into some, like, starting in verse 2, we're going to get into some New Testament stuff. So I'm going to start reading in verse 1, and I'm going to talk about verse 1 for a little bit. And all right, so it says, if you're following along, chapter 5, verse 1, it says, now you are walled around with a wall. That's redundant. You are walled around with a wall. Siege is laid against us. With a rod, they strike the ruler of Israel upon the cheek. So this is, again, it's reinforcing the landscape that we're talking about, or that Micah is speaking into, where this foreign army is surrounding them in this siege warfare way. They're at the borders, they're at the walls of the city, and they're not going to let them, they're going to take over. Micah recognizes that. There's an interesting phrase in here, though, that is, with a rod, they strike the ruler of Israel upon the cheek. And you can go, like, if you've got a good study Bible, it'll show you some other cross references where this isn't like two guys, this isn't Hamilton and Burr where they're, fighting in old French style and slapping each other on the cheek. This is a sign of disrespect toward the leader, toward the king, really toward the nation then. And what I find interesting in here, as it's an affront, Israel itself is being challenged. We get into the New Testament, though, and the same God who appears in Jesus very quickly into his ministry in the Sermon on the Mount tells us, if you get slapped on the cheek, turn the other cheek. So I guess the first question, Keri, Lynn, if you want to jump in, is, so is Jesus' command a personal command for us to turn the other cheek when somebody offends us, or is Jesus talking about this kind of constant history of Israel and trying to call him in, like he later would say, my kingdom is not of this world? Is Jesus trying to tell us to live in a kingdom that is not in this world, or is this a personal command that we should just let people slap us around, I guess?
Yeah. So I think the answer that I have is like yes and no. Um, it's never a short answer with me. Everybody's very aware of this now. So I think about, I wonder if Jesus was using the turn the other cheek terminology in order to be contextual. Um, I think it was a way in which it's verbiage that they would have understood. I wonder if, like, today, Jesus would have said, like, don't let them subtweet about you. Right? Like, or something that would have made more sense to us. Because turn the other cheek, if you've ever been bullied and bullied physically, you don't turn the other cheek, you run away. Like, you don't hit back, right? That's not a good choice. I always got in trouble more for being the one that hit back than the one who threw the first punch in the first place. Like, that was in our house, you got more in trouble for being the one that responded. And so I think about, like, here where we're seeing, it's an insult, right? When the cheek of the ruler is what's slapped or striked or whatever, stricken, my bad. And so that is a dismantling of the hierarchy that they know and they live in their context, right? And so for Micah, it's not that all of you are going to get struck upon the cheek, it's that your leader is going to be. And so when Jesus says this, I wonder if it's a way in which it maybe communicates and asks this question alongside Micah, like, who is our leader? And what leaders are we following in the way we see how they respond? I think about, like, as a pastor, and you and I've talked about this, there are certain pastors that we're following their lead. We're making our own decisions. We're not just blindly following other people in the North Texas Conference, although we love them, like, shouts out. But, we have certain people that we look up to. We have certain people we're following their lead. And so I wonder if with Jesus, it's a contextual example. Because no, like, I don't think we're meant to be just, like, completely tossed around. Like, I don't think that's a life of peace and love and hope that Jesus
Right.
has for us. That sounds horrible.
Yeah.
I do think that the notion of turn the other cheek that Jesus brings up is so unheard of at the time. I mean, it was one of those, like, excuse me, what? Like we talked about last week, like war was something you learn. It's part of grade school. For us, it'd be like not learning the alphabet, right? And so it was this whole other idea. So yes and no, kind of, not really, to your question.
No, I think you covered
Yeah.
it beautifully, and I think the idea that Jesus is challenging what our leadership looks like, or who we're really following, based upon, because if your king gets struck in the cheek, you kind of personally take an affront to that, and you're ready to go to war for your nation or your king. And I'm, we could liken it to current political parties that every political party, instead of having this set of ideals, now just has one hero that seems to embody, like, the support of all the political parties, or at least their political party, and that person gets slapped on the cheek, and it's a moment of honor. Then, like, if you don't fight back, then you don't preserve honor. And this was a very honor-based society, right? That's the reason why young women were always kept under lock and key, and various other things. Like, there was honor was a big thing. And so I think what Jesus, I mean, as you're saying, I think it's great to think about Jesus comes and tries to pull us out of that into a new context of a leadership of love, essentially. Let's see. Charlotte says, even if I don't fully agree with the leader, I will still feel that offense if they are being made fun of or slammed. Yeah, I think we all kind of, in ways that we identify, like when we put on a hat that says we are this label, if someone, the leader of that group, gets offended or slapped around, whether we agree with them totally or not, I think, yeah, Charlotte's absolutely right with that. It takes an affront with that. It's kind of like, my buddy Carl and Carl ought to be a sports historian. He remembers everything about every game we ever watched, about every team. And we were talking at old Mavericks stuff, and I remember, as the Mavericks were making their title run, I guess back in back when they lost, when they were in 2006, and people started, like, they were attacking Dirk, and Dirk can stick up for himself, but then they started saying stuff about some player on the, like, Eric Dampier or something, and who we didn't care for. We didn't think he should be on the team. but they started, and we remember how viscerally, like when kids at school would make fun of Eric Dampier, we would like attack them back, because and even though we didn't care. So I do think there's something to be said about Jesus calling us to a new way that isn't an honor-based system; it's a love-based system, and the best way to do. So for everyone participating here tonight, let's kind of keep this theme is going to crop up through chapter 5 of practical versus ideal, and especially following chapter 4, in which Keri Lynn did a great job of teaching us about, the passage that says they're not going to study war anymore. Like they're not, like they're going to learn their ABCs instead of how to bludgeon somebody to death now. And in chapter 5, we're going to come and we're going to see the king get his face slapped, and you'll see this other language that really is vindicating of the Israelites. It gives them meaning and purpose and hope, and it's very bloody. So be thinking about this question of the ideal of the kingdom versus the practical of the kingdom, as well as what does peace mean to us. So I guess that's a good question for now, is you can comment along, like, what do y'all think peace means in our modern context? And Keri Lynn, what do you think peace means in Micah?
So in Micah, I would go back to what we learned last week, and it'll be important for this week as well, about anytime we see the word Zion in a prophetic work, it's this physical, spiritual, and I would even say like mental ideal for, in this context, Jewish people, Israel. But Zion is this idea of this mountaintop that overlooks, I believe, Jerusalem. I could be totally wrong on that. But it's supposed to be this place where you meet. Got it. Yeah. Sometimes I'm just not confident. No, so it's supposed to be this, mountains were where you met God, right? Mount Sinai is where Moses has conversations with God and receives the 10 Commandments. And so Mount Zion is supposed to be this like spiritual, like receive instruction from God in the world of Zion, when Zion's talked about like humans kind of stop being horrible to one another, which would be awesome, right? So when you ask this question about peace in Micah, short answer, it's Zion, right? It's the spiritual ideal. It's this place where God is heard clearly, God is understood clearly, but God is speaking love, right? Zion's not a place where you go to receive judgment, right? Where you go to hear what you've done wrong. Zion's where you receive instruction and teaching from God. And I think about the good teachers in my life and think about what that would be like to have God be like some of those men and women I had as some of my favorite teachers, and to sit at their feet. And I had professors in college and seminary that they're the type of people you want to go and some of them honestly like sit and have a beer with, but like just sit in their living room and just listen to them talk all day. Like that was Zion. So that's how I think about peace, is sitting and receiving teaching from God, and it being full of love and full of mission and full of hope for what's to come.
Yeah, I think that's an important.
For Micah.
Right, for sure. I think Zion's Dad, welcome. Dad, we talked about this last week, actually, when we were talking about Zion, is I hadn't connected the Matrix reference totally yet, but I guess the instruction piece is like Neo wakes up, goes to Zion, and like learns the truth about the world. And I'm glad you brought that up, because I had not brought that up in the notes, and it really is important to think of this ideal all the way back to Genesis 12, in which there's going to be a nation amongst nations, over nations, and all the nations of the world are going to want to come rest at the foothills of Zion. And so when we're talking about peace, like Charlotte Charlotte gave an answer like I would give, is love each other even when we don't agree to disagree without the butting of heads. That may be what we would say today in a world that has known democracy and has some sort of idea of what egalitarian means. In the Bible, I'm not sure that peace, at least in Micah, isn't kind of a peace through victory. When the Lord comes in his day, or God's day, he'll take care of everything and everybody will come learn. And so we won't study war anymore because we'll all be subjugated to God. But I guess we'll get into kind of some of the other non-peaceful language here. So let me keep on reading. I'm going to do verses 2 through 5, kind of the beginning of 5 here. So we're besieged, and that's the bad news. But here's the good news that comes. Verse 2, it says, "But you, O Bethlehem of Ephrathah, who are one of the little clans of Judah, from you shall come forth for me one who is to rule in Israel, whose origin is from old, from ancient days. Therefore he shall give them up until the time when she who is in labor has brought forth. Then the rest of his kindred shall return to the people of Israel." I'm going to give 20 points to, I want you to comment who you think this is about. And we'll give 20 points to everybody who comments. So, then the rest of his kindred shall return to the people of Israel. And he shall stand and feed his flock in the strength of the Lord, in the majesty of the name of the Lord his God. And they shall live secure, for now he shall be great to the ends of the earth, and he shall be the one of peace. So 20 points to anybody who comments who they think this is telling about. And I'm going to wait a little bit to see who people comment that this is about, because, and I'll give a little clue as to what I'm expecting. This passage is read during Advent or Christmas Eve in thousands of churches around the world every single time. So go ahead.
It's about
Huh?
Iron Man.
Yes, Iron Man. I think I quoted Little John, the rapper, in a Christmas Eve sermon one time accidentally. But then I highlighted that I accidentally did it, so it just made it that much more awkward. But if you go ask Rachel Smith, it's her favorite church moment in history. And all I was doing was giving communion instructions. I was like, okay, from everyone from the window to the wall, and like a quarter of the people in there started laughing. So, all right, Steve Batchelor gets 20 points. I guess we're going to give Steve 40 points because he's the only one who chimed in so far, and he'll win the grand prize of pride.
Nothing. Pride. Okay.
Pride is good, yeah. There we go. Laura gets 20 points as well. But I feel like Laura might have copied Steve. That or the feed is just slow. I'm not sure. But we'll give Laura 40 points too. So this very much sounds like Jesus. And when you hear people talk about the coming of Christ and the prophecies and all, this is one of those, like, I don't know. I think there's probably about like 20 of them, or maybe 11 to 20 verses that I would look at and say, okay, yeah, that sounds reasonable. Some people say there's about 60 different prophecies about Jesus coming in the Old Testament. I would say there's a lot less than that, but I also read the Bible a little bit differently than they do, probably. So here, yeah, we very much have this some leader is going to come out of Bethlehem. And if you haven't heard in any Advent sermons recently, that Bethlehem is really a farm town. It's called the House of Bread. They make wheat. They harvest wheat. They provide bread to Jerusalem. They are not even a suburb. I mean, they're only 6 miles away, but they're the farming town down the road. And so it kind of would have been like when people say, what good can come out of Nazareth? The idea that this king is going to, there's someone who's going to bring peace and lift them up and stand and feed his flock in the strength of the Lord. Like, Bethlehem is not the ideal candidate, to come out. It's kind of like when a 5-star recruit comes out of like Anna, right? It's just not anything you expect them to come out of an Allen or a South Lake Carroll or something. So this is a pretty surprising thing. And the question is that I would ask, us is, does this actually talk about Jesus? And I ask that in a nuanced way because is it predicting the actual person of Jesus in the way that we have experienced Jesus? Or is it talking about the mold of someone that Jesus fills, that God intentionally fills the gaps there so that we'll recognize what Jesus is supposed to be? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, a couple of thoughts. And just some again, I to the lake brought with me my Robert Atler
Very nice.
translation and commentary.
You get
So
20 points.
he had a couple things to say about this section that I'd love to continue to kind of put in our brains as we think about the question, is this section about Jesus? So the reference of Bethlehem, if you are Jewish in this context, the reference of Bethlehem is a throw to David,
Yeah.
not you, not this David. I don't know which way it points. Right. And so my Old Testament professor, Dr. Heller, shouts out to him, taught us very well that 2 Samuel 7 is one of the most important passages in the Bible. He would argue the most important. 2 Samuel 7 is the passage where God establishes the covenant with David that his kingdom will reign forever, forever. It says forever like 20 times in there. So when it says here that there's going to be a great leader out of Bethlehem for these people, what it means to them in their context is that God's covenant is continuing to be fulfilled. God is not backing down on God's promises, even though y'all really messed up and there's a lot of destruction coming. So could it be about Jesus? Absolutely. It totally could be something. If there's one thing that I see in scripture, oh, we lost David. Here is our nightly. David's having internet problems. So I'm sure he'll be back momentarily, but we'll just keep talking until he does. But what I see in scripture when we see sections like this is from the entirety of scripture, from Genesis all the way through to Revelation, God is unchanging and God is consistent. And I know that there's some people who see in scripture that God changes. I think the way humans view God changes. And so when we're looking at this section, when we're looking at sections that prophesy Jesus in the Old Testament, that's 100% what totally could be going on, because God knows what God is going to do. God is very consistent throughout scripture. And we're getting David back.
I thought I had my issues early, but like you're at a lake house and you're streaming well, and for some reason I can't do it from home.
Well, I may have threatened my brother with an inch of his life that if he put any of his devices on the Wi-Fi during Bible study, that we were going to have problems. So I also am the only one on the internet presently.
Yeah, that might be the case too. So
I'm getting great at filling for time.
You're getting good at it. I mean, this is part of the whole training of associate pastor land, is making sure that you can handle crisis.
It's kind of what that is the COVID-19 version of you calling on Saturday night saying you're sick and can't preach the sermon.
I mean, we'll wait until I was waiting until you're at the lake house, but this Sunday I might just have a stomach flu or something.
Oh gosh.
Yeah. So anyway, I don't know how far you went into that, but I did. Yeah, I was going to get into that because one of the things they said in verse 2 is from you shall come forth from me one who is to rule in Israel, and then it says whose origin is from of old, from ancient of days. And usually as Christians we think of that and we think in this Trinitarian concept of like, oh, Jesus, John 1 says that all things were created through Jesus, and so of course of old days, and this refers to Jesus. But when the Hebrew Bible says from the ancient of days in this context, it's talking about David because it's hearkening back to this covenant, like you said in 1 Samuel, where you can almost read that and say from the good old days, when things were the way they were supposed to be. And this is where like Matthew especially goes out of his way, including all of these people in Jesus's genealogy, to make sure that Jesus fits this bill and fits the description. So I raise that question again because about prophetic literature, we tend to look at so I will say that my faith is, and the way I read the Bible is very Christocentric. When I look at Deuteronomy and I look at the Old Testament, especially like at Joshua, and I see God commanding them to massacre every baby, I don't see Jesus doing that. I see Jesus reaching out to Samaritan babies and loving them. And so I'll look at Joshua a little bit more skeptical because the way I read the Bible is very Christocentric. But when we look at prophetic literature, even if people are like, okay, look, we can't, some people think like Ezekiel 35 foretells this war between Russia and the rest of the world, or Russia and Israel or something. And there's some people who think the internet is predicted in the Bible. So it kind of goes
Wait,
in a,
what?
yeah, there's something about like communication will be rampant or word will spread quickly. And if you are in this mindset of, if you are in this mindset of the Bible predicts the future, then then it makes sense. But but most people would look at it and say, okay, well, the Bible doesn't predict the internet, but it certainly leads toward Jesus, and that even in the Old Testament, it was leaning toward Jesus. And so, from a Trinitarian theology, we say yes, Jesus was always there, but then the question becomes, okay, well, why did they have to go through all of that? Why didn't Jesus just come at the beginning and forgive us, and we could live this life now? So I find it important to rectify some of those weird questions that come up to say that Jesus fits the mold here because Jesus is the answer to Israelites wailing and calling for hope. And I think God did some of the things on purpose so that they would recognize who this was supposed to be. But if we say that it's like foretelling the future and we're getting into oracles, you're running down this real slippery slope of, well, why didn't God just do it sooner? Or why didn't, or if you run down the real slippery slope, it's that, the Bible predicted the internet back in 4000 BC or something like that. And I'm all for God's wisdom and God's eternal knowledge, but I think you're running down a real slip. Because if you say God predicted the internet in Ezekiel, then you also get to follow the strange people who say, well, God predicted that like the Jews should die in the Holocaust, and other really dangerous things. So it's just a real slippery slope. So I bring that up for that reason. But the other thing about this passage, it's not the only passage in which hope comes out of a birth. And I think of Isaiah 6. I think it's, this child will be born. In the Bible, when a child is allowed to be born, it means God has a future for that child, in kind of a prophetic sense. And even when Jesus is talking to Nicodemus, he says, well, no one can enter the kingdom unless they've been reborn. So I find this interesting that most of the like oracles or most of the prophecies of hope or the talks about hope always come from a new life and a new generation as opposed to something internal. It's kind of the new wine for old wineskins. So I guess what would you say is, so how much change do you think we can actually affect in our present time? And how much do we have to be reborn into something new to have something shift? Or does it really, like Thomas Jefferson said, every generation needs their own revolution. So what would you say about our ability to actually change things in the midst of living in that way of life?
Yeah. This is a great question, especially for I talked last week a little bit about my just absolute adoration for history. And again, like shouts out to my dad for instilling that in me continuously. Because I think about that quote, that every generation needs a revolution. That's certainly been true in the context of at least American history, if not world history, right? Like we can track kind of patterns of events and patterns where history repeats itself constantly. So yes, are there certain revolutions that have to happen for big change? I think absolutely. I do not think that because a revolution ends that all the problems are solved for that particular context. Like when the United States won the American Revolution, and again, Hamilton, huge plug, Hamilton, the entire second half just like explores, these people had to figure out how to build a country afterwards,
Yeah.
right? Like the problems were not done. So but on the flip side, in order to do my job and in order to be the kind of pastor I want to be, I have to believe that we can affect real change.
Yeah.
Because I think that that's part of my calling is to inspire and empower and work with people to affect change, right? I do not, like, I'm not in it. What's the word I'm looking for? It's going to sound goofy. I don't know, like, our job is to empower the people in our church to change the world, right?
Right.
I'm not a CEO of a major company. And so truthfully, there's not a whole lot of big things I can change. But I think it's important to work with the people who are part of our church and who are part of our community in order to kind of expand across all areas. I love the close relationship that our church has with Lovejoy ISD, with Michael Goddard, who's, follows me on Instagram now.
You've made it in the world.
I've made it in Allen, that's for sure. No, but I think about, like, I'm not a Lovejoy alum. I'm not even from the area like you are, truthfully, and I'm not the senior pastor. Like, it's there's really no reason for us to really work together. And yet, like, Dr. Goddard works so closely with our church and works so closely with other churches in the area in order to affect change in our community. And I think that that's so I have to believe that we can. I also am often a pessimist and often worst case scenario gal. And so sometimes I question the amount of change that can be affected in a certain amount of time. I think there are certain things that I even now say I may not see that in my lifetime, which is sad because I'm so young, but it's true. I think that certain things take time. Again, I brought up the example last week, but on June 4th, we're celebrating the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote on a federal level. And, it's 2020 and we've still yet to see a female president. So things like that I think would prove to me that real change is happening. It takes a very long time. 100 years is a long time.
Yeah. I think, and Debbie had a real good point or a real good question. It says, are they revolutions or revelations? And I think that's a little bit of the rebirth aspect of, it doesn't take a rebirth of an entire generation or a changeover of the people. It just takes the change of heart. And I think this is where, in like Micah's case, they're looking for a new leader. I think in a lot in the Old Testament, they're looking for heroes to come along. And part of what Jesus does different is point them back to this idea that all of them are heroes. Like, all of them have the image of God, that they're created, and they all have creative ability to shape the world. So it does take this kind of, I think where Micah's going to get to here in a little bit is where they were in the feudal system, the honor system, the power system, this corrupt environment that is seeking to gain just for itself. They have to have a rebirth into the ideology of what it means to be God's kingdom and die to the old self to live into the peace that God has. So I do think, I'm with you. It'd be really hard to get up in the morning and be a pastor if you really didn't believe that God's Spirit could change things in the world. And I think I've seen way too many personal transformations in people's lives to believe that we're just stuck. So, but in all those major ones, like, I'm just thinking about people who are celebrating anniversaries of sobriety right now, that, we worked through and gave them resources for. It really took a large awakening and a rebirth in their own lives. So I'm just always fascinated, especially in the Old Testament, that there's always a birth. And then you get to Revelation and it's like, well, there's always a woman who's going to have a baby. And so, new life springs forth and does that. So, all right, let me go to the last. Sorry, go ahead.
Just Debbie is quoting Hamilton on accident because Angelica Schuyler says, "You want a revolution, I want a revelation."
There you go. That's right.
That's all I have.
So yeah, for those of you who didn't know, Hamilton is streaming on Disney Plus on July 3rd, and Keri, Lynn, and I are just a little excited about this. So it's popping up, probably more than it should.
Every conversation now, somehow, instead of like 6 degrees to Kevin Bacon, David and Keri Lynn are like 2 degrees to Hamilton.
That's right. So, all right, so I am going to read for a while. the end of verse 5, and then like really all the way to the end. I may stop here or there, but what's going to happen in this is you're going to see. So up until now, it's essentially like, okay, we've talked about we're not going to study war anymore, and there's going to be a time when they're going to beat their swords into plowshares, and then we get into verse 5, and it's, well, there's going to be someone arise out of this little known place called Bethlehem, and they're going to be the one who brings peace and stands strong in the Lord, and it's all very hunky dory. Then we get into the second part of verse 5, and I'll just let you listen to what peace is in Micah, because we've heard the ideal right now, and we're about to get into the practical of the ideal being God's truth in the situation of what it should look like. We're about to get into the practical of what might happen or what they expect to happen. And I want you to kind of be asking the question in your mind of how much does our, like, if we were the one under siege or under trouble, or we were the ones who were getting oppressed, how much of this is what we would want God to do for us? And how much of this is our projection of what God does versus what God actually does? So, all right, I'm going to read. Kind of 5b here. It says, if the Assyrians come into our land and tread upon our soil, we will raise against them 7 shepherds and 8 installed as rulers. So that's essentially saying there's going to be plenty of leaders. We're not going to be shy of anybody stepping up to confront the Assyrians. They shall rule the land of Assyria with the sword. And so get this now, we're not under siege anymore in Jerusalem. These guys are going to go into Assyria and rule it now. So the tables are turned, and we're doing the conquering. And the land of Nimrod, which is not a name for someone who's stupid. Nimrod is the ancient Babylon, or ancient Assyrian city. I think is the capital, actually. And the land of Nimrod with the drawn sword. Notice they're not going in for peace talks. They are going in the spirit of the Lord, and they're going to rule these foreign people with the sword about a chapter after they were going to turn their swords into plowshares. So we're just, yeah. So they shall rescue us from the Assyrians if they come into our land or tread within our border. And then we get into verse 7 here. And this is that word remnant. The remnant is the people left behind. And this is kind of into the Babylonian exile here, where they shift historical events. But the remnant is the people left behind. And you think of remnant in Noah and his family in the ark. Think of remnant as the people left behind in the Babylonian exile. You think of remnant as Elijah, who's the remaining prophet. Like, there's always somebody that God is working through. It never goes away. And we talk about this kind of in the church world of, like, the way that church looks now might disappear because and a new form is going to crop up, but God will never abandon the church. There will always be a remnant in which God is working through. It may just take, like, death of an institution for God to really move and work in the world. And we're kind of seeing some really good things out of COVID-19 in terms of spiritual growth, which is sad and interesting, but also good. So, and feel free to stop me, Keri, Lynn, by the way. So it says, then the remnant of Jacob, surrounded by many people, shall be like dew from the Lord, like showers on the grass, which do not depend upon people or wait for any mortal. So this is not like dew in a refreshing meadow. You just woke up from a cabin and there's lovely dew on the ground. This is like, they're like dew because they're everywhere and they're coating everything. Like, they are a force to be reckoned with. And among the nation, the remnant of Jacob, surrounded by many peoples, so they're going to gather people like Zion, shall be like a lion among the animals of the forest, like a young lion among the flocks of sheep. So the lion and the sheep are not laying down together here. The lion is totally taking care of the sheep and chewing it up, which, when it goes through, treads down and tears in pieces with no one to deliver. Your hand shall be lifted up over your adversaries, and all your enemies shall be cut off. In that day, says the Lord, I will cut off your horses from among you, and will destroy your chariots. And I will cut off the cities of your land, and throw down all your strongholds. And I will cut off the sorceries from your hand, and you shall have no more soothsayers. And I will cut off your images and your pillars from among you, and you shall bow down no more to the work of your hands. And I will uproot your sacred poles from among you and destroy your towns. And in anger and wrath, I will execute vengeance on the nations that did not obey. So finally, we've got some Old Testament God language about anger and wrath.
Can I just have my weekly plug for this is why we do not take one verse from the Bible and claim that it has everything to say about God. Verse 9 is exact proof. Your hand shall be lifted up over your adversaries, and all your enemies shall be cut off.
Amen.
To any middle schoolers who might be watching this, that does not mean that your bullies are going to get stomped.
Right. Yeah. Well, and it also doesn't give justification for like all the way up until probably World War I and maybe even afterward. Like World War I, Karl Barth wrote after World War I, and he had this big theological dilemma of every nation went into World War I, especially in Europe, with a monarchy that was put there by God in their view. And so every nation thought God is on our side going into this because our king or queen or prince or whatever is God ordained. And it became this real big theological conundrum of, well, if everybody is ordained by God to be there and fight, who wins? And does God choose winners and losers and all? And so that's where Karl Barth came up with this idea of God is the holy other, and God is not actually ordaining kings, that kings simply serve a function of safety and security as opposed to like doing God's will. And so it's a really good point, because you could read most of this part in Micah, and if you're the one who's getting stomped on, you can use it as divine justification for whatever atrocities you want to commit. Honestly, the Bible is very dangerous that way.
So I've always like wondered, now I'm just this hilarious, like unfiltered thought of like when missionaries go to foreign countries and they're just like dropping Bibles off in like remote African villages or like mega like Indian like urban cities. I always wonder like what would happen if like you've never been handed a Bible in your life and you open it up to Micah 5:9. Like
right.
I've just always wondered, scripture is dangerous when not looked at the whole.
Mm-hmm.
And prophetic language especially can get very dangerous very quick. So what started out as a funny plug is now a very serious warning for everyone.
Yeah, no, and it ought to be. I think, there's still I'm proud to be an American as anybody else, but there's still a sense of American exceptionalism and divine right and manifest destiny. And so it can be very easily, it was very easy for me growing up when, the first Operation Desert Storm was going on in 1992, I think. And we're in the middle of Bible study and we're reading about Joshua and the Battle of Jericho. Well, who do you think we instantly put as the enemy is Jericho? It's certainly not us. So it's very easy to read yourself into the story as opposed to letting the story create you anew and be reborn through the story. But it also goes into when you're reading Micah, like there's the hope and the truth spoken into it. And then there's the real human practical value of, yes, all that sounds nice to beat our swords into plowshares, but it's not going to free us. And so we need to go kick some tail and take some names. And I find it interesting that it shifts a little bit to where the remnant of Jacob, God's going to empower them to go like rule the Assyrians in 7 through 9. But then in verse 10, it says, okay, when that day comes, there's going to be a little bit of a shift. So yes, God will do some inspiring and fighting for you and with you, but I will cut off your horses from among you and will destroy your chariots. And so I find it fascinating that yes, we're going to go attack, but you cannot rely upon your military might anymore. You have to rely upon God. And there's a big difference. Like the only thing that Robert Jeffers and I have ever agreed on in my entire life was, maybe not the only thing, but certainly one of the only things I assume, is he did a sermon and I cannot believe he didn't receive more flack for this. But he did an entire sermon that I happened to tune into the radio and hear, in which he said one of the biggest sins of America is that our defense spending budget is like half to 3/4 of our national spending, and how we have placed our fate and our hope in the hands of our military. And like, the more I watch documentaries, the more I recognize how necessary it is to have a military presence that expands far away from us to keep us safe here in the world that we live in. And so I agree, like, practically I appreciate that. But on the other hand, I hear like this hyper conservative guy who has Donald Trump in his sanctuary and Sean Hannity in his sanctuary, and like he's Mr. Fox News and pro America. And again, that's not bad necessarily. Like, I'm as proud to be an American as the next person, but this person who appears in like hyper conservative pro America stuff is questioning our defense spending because we've relied too much on our horses and chariots to do the job. So I don't know. I guess I don't know. People can comment here if we want to start into a really troubling, controversial conversation, but like, how much do we in the 21st century rely upon our politicians or our systems or our military or anything for our peace? And if we rely upon that for our peace, are we distorting the ideal vision of peace that Micah gives us? So, any thoughts?
Yeah. So I'll jump in and maybe make it more controversial and worse than it already is, because that's my job. So I think when David says politicians, I really want to challenge what we're thinking, because I think too, some of us will hear politicians and we'll immediately think of certain politicians that we disagree with, and we'll say, well, I don't trust so and so. But I want you to think about, like, within who you trust politically, right? Whether that person is president or not, like are we putting our trust in, like, is your trust blindly in a political party, right? Are you only going to follow one spot because that's where your safety is, right? And this is not calling out one party over the other, right? We all do it,
Right.
And so,
recently, I think it was Pure Barna found that you used to be able to determine somebody's political party based upon what kind of church they went to. And for the first time ever, they determined that you can't determine that anymore, but you can determine what kind of church. I'm trying to remember. Oh yeah, so you can determine what kind of church somebody goes to based upon their political party now. And especially, and part of that same study or survey was the amount of people who place their faith in politics. Like, you say, well, what's the cure for all of society's ills? You know, even 10 years ago, still the majority would say religion of some sort. And now it's like over 70% or something said politics. And so they're looking for, when we're talking about hope and we're talking about what's going to bring peace, the majority of people in America are on either side of the aisle are not saying church or social services or kindness. They're saying politics. And you can start to understand why there's so much investment in, and maybe so much vitriol as well in the political party, because that's where people's hope is these days.
We've got a couple of comments if we want to respond to some of these.
Yeah. So, yeah, Debbie. So I think Debbie, maybe not. So Debbie comments isn't also based on who's writing and the type of day they're having, which could be. I don't know if exactly like the Bible is just that day's emotions, but it certainly reflects the attitude of the time. And like, I referenced Joshua a few times, and when it says slaughter, it actually says sacrifice every man, woman, and child. And the word for that is haram. And it's a divine sacrifice in which if you don't give it all to God, then you might use it for yourself. And therefore it's not like you're not dedicating it to God. So they would they would massacre everyone because if they didn't, they might use them as slaves or wives or whatever. And so it wasn't like this total hateful act. It was just they thought it was honoring God to totally decimate everything. Um, if we go into a war, hopefully, are not looking to eradicate the entire civilization that is in front of, and hopefully Christians would not support that action. Like mass genocide is not something any Christians should support.
Well, and that breaks current rules of engagement, I believe.
Oh, for sure.
Ever since World War II and the Holocaust, the United Nations, there are rules for war and complete eradication of a certain type of nation or tribe or whatever word you want to replace there is you would be persecuted under international law of war now.
Right.
Now, again, like you're saying, wanting of that, right, is not of God. Even with countries that we find ourselves at odds with, I don't think that that's something that God wants from us,
Right.
if we even ever spoke that, much less acted upon it.
I see here. So, what was it? Steve's talking about if we put our trust in politics, does ends justify means, which is Nikolai Machiavelli back in the day. The Prince. It's a great book. And Bill Bradford just commented, the trust in political parties is a form of idolatry. I think so. To not be shy, I would say yes in some respects. As somebody who thinks that politics can do a lot of good in the world, and I do have kind of an idealism about politics that gets thrown under the bus most days. I do think it gives into a slippery slope when that does become your primary hope, like when you don't have some external source of hope like God. Then you're willing to look past all the indiscretions of your party or your representatives, or even the writers. They slip into a bill somewhere if your agenda that you believe in as the hope for the future comes in. So I do think that to me is where idolatry comes in. And Jenny comments on it that government has grown so much in the last 50 years. I mean, probably since World War II and the New Deal, or the Great Depression, the New Deal, and World War II and war powers and everything like that came with the Patriot Act. Like, government certainly has grown, and the churches haven't grown with it. So we put our resources in something. And I'm pleased. I don't want anybody here in this conversation that we're anti-government or anti-military or anti-politics at all. Like, please don't hear that. But in the vein of like prophetic literature, like Micah and Amos and Hosea and Nahum, like Jeremiah, Isaiah, they don't lend themselves to like totally peaceful conversations about just hugging each other. They bring up these really sticky points of how, like, here's the ideal and here's the practical. And we're living in the practical, which causes us to go invade Nineveh and take them hostage to be peaceful. Like, the Roman Empire talked about the Pax Romana. It was this great peace in which so many things were allowed to thrive. I mean, Christianity owes its mass spread to the Roman peace. And the Roman peace came about because they were killing all these other people on the outskirts of the empire and expanding. So that's where prophetic literature is so helpful, is to recognize, yes, Augustus Caesar created this environment where the church could grow like wildfire, and we are the recipients of good news, of eternal glory because of that. But it meant that a lot of German people and Britain people died at the same time. And so it forces us to confront that, yes, while we are the beneficiaries of good things that these people do, we also have to recognize it's not the ideal. And I was taught that part of preaching is, no matter how hard it is, you preach the ideal. And we work toward the ideal, even though it often isn't practical for today's world. So I don't want anybody to hear that we're like anti-politics or anti-government or anti-military, because we're certainly not. They play a great practical role. And, if we didn't have government, without like the peace of Christ in everybody's heart, or at least some sort of idea of peace, like there'd be chaos. So I think we need it. I think it's just Micah forces us to reflect on if Micah here is telling us that in order to gain victory, we have to give up control. That's a really poignant statement for people who are doing everything they can to buy somebody else's business or get somebody elected or whatever. And, along comes Jesus and tells us to turn the other cheek in order to find peace. So I think that it just raises a lot of questions. So I don't want anybody to get the wrong idea of what we're doing. We're trying to get at the point of not criticizing what we're doing, but finding what should we be doing.
Yeah, and I think just to add to your point, and even to Bill's question, when I think about idolatry, I wonder, for me, I would think the things that I maybe idolized are the things that I really, really, really struggle to let go of. And I think also here very clearly, and I think it's okay that I speak for both of us in all of this, like David and I would never claim that we have everything like totally figured out. Yeah, okay, good. And so there are things that I idolize even still, right? And there are things I hold tightly to, and things that I try to think about. The things that I idolize, it's such a strange verb, are the things that take up the space in my thinking. The things that are not thinking about God or the ways that God would have me serve, or the ways that God moves in this world, and even just the ways of love, right? And so the thinking about maybe what takes up your brain space right now, and if a lot of it is fighting about political stances, and it's important work, and social justice is an important part of our being as Christians, but at what point is it taking up more of your thinking than something else? And maybe that can be where the line is. If the question is, where's the line? I think that's something I've had to really examine, especially in this time of COVID, where as a person with fairly high functioning anxiety, I've had to face that, right? How often am I thinking about how anxious I am, which is just making me more anxious, and controlling what I can control, especially as we set into COVID fatigue. And this is the normal. I was talking to my roommate today, weird because the first couple of weeks we were reacting and coming up with new things, and now we're just like in a routine that we don't like, right? Like I can't go anywhere and it's awful, but I'm going to get up and do work because that's what I need to do. So maybe just as a challenge to people, and come back to what we're doing, think about what's taking up your brain space right now, and see what could be let go, or what could take up less of our brain space, so that there's more room for the things that God has to say in Micah and in other pieces of scripture and in experience as well.
Yeah. I think, when you're talking about what takes up your brain space and what you're thinking about, there's this weird, funny thing that you're looking for hope in whatever that is. And so even if it is anxiety feels normal. So that's hope because it feels normal. And that's where this whole litany of like, okay, when God comes to do this, these are the things that you're not going to have anymore. And so you're not going to have your false religions of the Canaanites. You're going to go to a more pure religion of the one true God. You're not going to have your sorcerers and your fortune tellers that are going to provide you with, false wisdom on what you should bet, which horse you should bet on, or, who's going to win the World Series, or something, in 2021, when we have baseball again. Even as strong as verse 11, it says, I will cut off the cities of your land and throw down all your strongholds. And I can only imagine if there's the old question of if Jesus came back. And so Jesus comes back and says, okay, we're going to have to sacrifice Dallas Fort Worth because, or New York City or Los Angeles or Seattle or Chicago. Like, we're going to have to sacrifice one of those because so many people are placing their hope in the leadership of those cities or how those cities are doing, or they take so much pride in Abu Dhabi or Dubai having the world's tallest building, and we're going to have to lower your sense of pride in your city, despite what like the Beach Boys would say, be true to your school. Even if you went and you went to Allen and said, okay, you have a choice. You can either tear down your church or you can tear down the Allen Eagle football stadium. That might, that would be a question I think that God would ask in this day. Which one's more important? And I'm not so sure I think there'd be a lot of justification by Allen Eagle people, including maybe myself, to say, well, we can do church anywhere. That stadium was expensive. We need to keep that up there. And I think that's where this whole litany is like, okay, well, do I spend most of my time wondering how the team's going to do this year? Or am I spending most of my time wondering like how I can influence the team to be in the world more like God wants us to be in the world? There. So I'm not going to get into some of these questions I think, because I think we'd go down a weird path there. One of the things I wanted to ask though is, I guess if you want to comment on like what would be something. What's something, honestly, if this were a Lenten sermon series, what is something that you probably need to exit out of your brain a little bit more in order to trust God? So if, and I'm using, Keri Don, that's awesome. The stadium would hold a great congregation. That is true. We could get 17,000, 27,000 people in there. This is our growth plan. So I'm just thinking about like, so I do think, like, what if we're asking the question, what is something we need to individually give up to like trust God more? And it could, obviously money and those things are easy answers, but you brought up anxiety. And I have found in people who do have anxiety that it's a comfort zone because it's normalized. And giving up anxiety is kind of like giving up alcohol. And it's not that, neither of them are easy. They're both kind of like mental addictions of sorts. Speaking as somebody who doesn't have anxiety, and I'm stumbling through because I don't have that experience, but in my talking to people and researching, they're afraid almost to not be anxious because that's how they know how to cope with the world.
Yeah.
So I guess what would be something that you feel like you need to give up, I suppose, in order to, what's some control you need to give up in order to trust God a little bit more?
So your point about anxiety is probably what the truthful answer would be. I think for me, one thing I've learned about anxiety, and this helps reduce the shame, anxiety is a body's natural response to stimuli. It is not a place that the body lives all the time. It's not a place that the brain lives all the time. And when you're anxious, when you're, if you go in a haunted house and you get spooked by something, there are chemicals in your brain that are imbalanced than they are normally when you're not anxious. And so, I think being highly anxious has become a comfort zone because I found some identity in being the anxious friend, because I'm always prepared, because I think through everything that could go wrong. And so maybe, something I could let go of is to think of what could go right instead, because that is not anxiety producing thoughts. And it also, I think part of me always said, well, if I think of the worst case scenario, then I'll be prepared when it happens. And I'm learning in a global pandemic that I can't come up with the worst case scenario. Even in my worst and darkest moments, I still didn't come up with this. And even though I didn't think of it and make a plan, it's still okay. And I'm still okay. And my people are still safe and healthy, and they're going to be safe and healthy no matter what happens continually, right? And so I think for me, that would be something to let go of or pay attention to my brain space to think about what would go right instead of what would go wrong.
Yeah. And thank you for being vulnerable. And please know that for you and anyone else who has anxiety, I realize this is not something that like you just flick a switch and control. Like this is something that people take medicine for.
Yeah.
It's similar to depression or anything else. It's kind of like we say, addiction is not a choice, it's a disease.
Right.
So please, anybody who's watching and know that I know that, and I'm not trying to be insensitive to that. I think for me, I'm trying to think of what I really like. I probably fit a little bit into the category of success. That if maybe that's my 3 Enneagram talking, but like if I'm not, I find when I'm not successful is when I start, it's kind of a double-edged sword. When I'm not successful, I start leaning into myself even more as opposed to not going to God in trust. And then when I am successful, I start forgetting that God was the one who got us there to begin with. And so the measuring stick is how am I successful as opposed to like, how am I just part of God's story? How am I part of what God is doing and just being delighted with that? I'm laughing a little bit because Julie Jones commented giving up control, and I think Randy commented just accepting, maybe. But the way I'm reading it is giving up control and just accepting Randy. So maybe that's the way it was meant. But the way, so yeah, like I think we all just kind of need to learn to accept Randy for what he is. And God maybe
did. Randy did text me and he said, I have an idea for a World Series champion in 2021, which of course, anybody who knows Randy Jones knows that he is not talking about the Texas Rangers.
No.
So I need to learn to accept Randy.
So, let's see. Using food for comfort, depending on internet for knowledge and direction for Kathy. Yeah, so Kathy Long, I would say that I resonate with Kathy too. I'm surprised. I think a lot of us do both of those, but yeah, using food for comfort is certainly, the way with our kids, when our kids are in a bad mood, we've started to get into like more of the mindful exercises and focusing on the here and now kind of thing. But for a long time, the assumption was if they're in a bad mood, they're just hungry. And the more we thought about what that precedent that sets is, okay, I'm having a bad day. Let me get the pint of ice cream out and go for it.
Right. Well, and I think to, again, go on another soapbox, I think Kathy brings up a good point too of, I think the same can be said for alcohol, especially right now. I'm just noticing more internet jokes about alcohol consumption. And I think it's just something to name that as we currently enter into a time where the pandemic's not going to be just 2 weeks, it's really important to look at what we're turning to for comfort and what we're turning to lower our anxiety, and the things that can be dangerous or bad habits or things that are not taken in moderation right now. So Kathy, I appreciate your vulnerability on that. And sorry, I used it for a soapbox, but as your friendly neighborhood pastor who does partake in adult beverages, we're just going to name that we need to be evaluating now that we're, 3 months in, kind of that our relationship with that is still healthy. If that's something that you can partake in.
Well, I think, and that's true. I had a big soapbox several years ago with this whole, when the whole how do we reach millennials for church thing came about and is still going on, even though millennials are like 35, 37 now. I think I'm on the front edge of that crowd. It was interesting because every single idea revolved around alcohol. There was nothing that came out that said you cannot reach millennials without alcohol. And I thought, well, what kind of message are we telling millennials that they're reduced down to, like, one, the church is dependent upon alcohol to get people to have any kind of experience with the Holy Spirit. And two, we're labeling alcohol, like we're labeling millennials as alcoholics.
Right.
And the dependency upon that. And I see that. I mean, obviously they're jokes, but I see it like you see it as what, it's kind of an interesting thing. There was a survey done a number of years ago that looked at, okay, when you're in times of trouble or you're in times of stress, what's the first thing you do? And mostly like people that we would label as minorities, like people of color, largely said pray. They would pray or they would sing. White people, affluent people, I would say affluent white people, not poor white people, but affluent white people, or middle class, said exercise and wine were the two things they immediately go for. And we promulgate those things. I mean, exercise is another, it can turn into an idol as well. The book I'll push is Religios or Seculosity by, I think Brian Zoll is his name, or David Zoll. It is such a great book at pointing out, like, not even food for comfort, but food as a foodie. And that it's like, the more I know how to cook and the better I am at that. So they become religious about how much they know about food and finding their identity in the fact that they know so much about food. It's really an interesting book. One thing, we're running out of time here. I'm going to bring up something that would take a whole lot of time to talk about. And it's kind of at the end, it's kind of a bow on, let me go let Monkey out first.
We're gonna, after he lets Monkey out, it's like a lightning round. Tough question, but fast answers.
Yeah. So one of the things that Pat, we talked about this a little bit, and where I think we ended up, it was, okay, well, what control do we need to give up to have a successful life in God's ways, which is really the question we wanted to end up on. And I probably should just let it go. But there's so many people who will read this and think, this is an example of God punishing the Israelites so that they'll end up better. And, bye, Laura. But we're not leaving yet. So
she said bye to Monkey.
Oh, bye to Monkey. Gotcha. Laura, I love that your favorite part about this is Monkey. So there's so many people who are going to read something like Micah and think, okay, this is God punishing the Israelites so they'll end up better, right? It's disciplining the child so that they end up better. And so it's kind of it's kind of a tough situation to talk about, or a tough thing to talk about quickly. But the question I would ask is, like, when does God let something happen? And I say let in big quotation marks. But like, when does God let you go through something that actually did turn out better? And I say this in terms of like, and my real dumb example is, I had a crush on a girl in middle school for like 3 years, and was naive enough that I was like, okay, God, if you'll just let me go out with her once, and like, would you please let this girl be my girlfriend? And expected, like, for some reason, that God was just going to turn her brain into loving me and we were going to be married and all sorts of things. And obviously that didn't happen. Like, I didn't go on my first date until like I was a junior in high school, I think. And so so basically being disappointed, having to quote unquote suffer through being the guy who never had a girlfriend, or being the guy who wasn't, thought of himself as attractive, whatever, in order that, well, now I have this wonderful wife and 2 great kids, and who knows what patterns of life would have happened, without that. So, I don't know. I'm bringing it up, and it's probably a question for big discussion, but it's does God let you go through things that eventually shape you to be better? Is this God does God work in the disappointment, I guess, or is God absent from the disappointment and then just gives a better, gives blessings out, beyond that? So any quick thoughts on
that? Yes, I'm going to go as quick as I possibly can. So this brings up a great point from the story of Hagar that I was not able to include for this week's sermon that I would love to use some of our remaining time to say, because I got a couple questions about this. So in Genesis chapter 16, if you missed it, would love for y'all to go back and watch that sermon. But God meets Hagar in the wilderness after Hagar runs from Sarai, who has mistreated her. In the original Hebrew would say that Sarai beat her. And God says to Hagar, go back to your mistress and submit to her.
Yeah.
And this is a very difficult passage to interpret by itself, right, without the rest of scripture. But I read a really great piece in seminary that talked about how in this situation, God sends Hagar back to her house, her family that she knew, and provides enough for Hagar to survive. Does not completely liberate Hagar and make her queen of the world and give her, her own castle. But God provides so that she might survive. And so I wonder if that is something that can kind of answer your question. No, God did not give you your heart's desires with the middle school crush. And same for my middle school crush. And honestly, thank God, if he's watching, you turned into kind of a jerk. But it's fine. We're not dropping names. But I think that God gives us what we need to survive, right? Because there's a big free will argument to be made if God intervenes every single time somebody asks their middle school crush to like them, right? Because even if she had, right, let's say God did turn her heart to like you, and you had gone on a date with her in middle school, which middle school dates are just cringy. Like, they're not even worth it.
Right,
any
exactly.
middle schoolers watching this, you don't need to be going on dates anytime soon. It's fine.
Amen.
Make friends. Yeah, you've got a middle schooler this fall, so I'll just keep preaching. But if God had turned her heart, if God had answered your prayer word for word, she wouldn't have loved you by her own choice, right? And that wouldn't have served you well. It wouldn't have served her well. Even in middle school, which middle school relationships are just cringy. But I think about, and again, Hagar and your middle school crush are very wide ends of the spectrum to compare. But I think the notion stays the same of, God gives us what we need to survive. I think about situations in which last year in the job that I was at, I really wanted to stay. It was a place that I had worked for a really long time, and that was really comfortable. And I had a talk with the senior pastor there, and he said, we can't keep you. You have to go elsewhere. This was your greenhouse, and you need to go be planted. This is literally what he said. He said, you need to go be planted somewhere else because you've grown out of the greenhouse here. You need to go be planted. And then sure enough, I go to my interview at Creekwood, and your whole mission statement is growing deep roots to share God's love. And so when that metaphor fit, and I think about the ways in which, and that's not what I wanted last year. That's not what I prayed for. I didn't know Creekwood. I didn't know it was as great as it is. But God provided better despite what I was asking for, and gave me much more than just the tools to survive. But I really do think, don't know if I would have passed the Board of Ordained Ministry without the experience I've gained at Creekwood to talk about and to theologize. So that's a very long-winded answer to something you asked for quickly. So I'm sorry about that. But
no, it's like impossible to answer that quickly. And I think you gave some great examples and great stories. And I love the phrase, God gives us what we need to survive. Because, I'm thinking about, thinking about families who have lost children, and their coping mechanism is, well, this is all part of God's plan. Something better is in store. And that fits in with kind of this exile theology of, okay, well, God's just punishing us now for something better. And I hate to think that God would ever do that. So I tend to lean more toward yes, bad things happen, hard things happen. God never leaves us in those and continues to give us, the example I used in a sermon one time, and I is that God is the ultimate backstop. And so you're trying to get the ball in from the outfield and you throw it, but life or you miss the shortstop amazingly bad. And so the pitcher tries to get it, and either he misses it and he tries to throw it, or it's an errant throw. And you're trying to get the guy at the plate, and the catcher misses it, but can only go as far as the backstop. And so if the backstop is eternal glory in heaven, that's as far as it goes. Like God wins. If the backstop is, okay, well, I'm going to find a job that helps me get enough of the bills, like that's God as the backstop. And so I do think that the passage where God works in the bad is that God keeps us alive so that we can continue to move our free will towards. And that is a difference in, I would say, prophetic Old Testament exile theology versus Christ theology in incarnational theology of God with us, as opposed to God kicking people's butts for us in there. So, yeah, and I totally recognize, like, people who are watching and people giving examples even or saying yes and agreeing that sometimes, bad things happen to us and they turn out better. And I think it's the hope and faith and love that Paul talks about that remain when all the gifts have gone, when nothing is special anymore and we feel beaten down. The things that remain are hope, faith, and love. And those are enough of a motivator to get to the next thing, which ends up being a blessing. So anyway, all right, we're at an hour and a half, which has largely been our cutoff time and my time to go help put the kids to bed. Not sure what they were doing the rest of the time, but they were playing Legos, I think.
So fun.
So, yeah, so fun. So anyway, thank you everybody for joining us today. We'll do Micah chapter 6 next week and then Micah chapter 7 the week after, which will conclude our journey through the ideal, the practical, the swords into plowshares, not studying war anymore, and all of the joys of Micah. And so, and I'm going to echo Julie Jones' comment about Darlene. Darlene, we are so glad that you are here as well. I'm glad everyone chimed in today, and I'm glad Monkey could join us for a little while. What we'd love for you to do is if you want to, you can comment on Facebook, I suppose. You can send us a message or send us a text or whatever. Like if there is a New Testament book that you are interested in studying, and I don't have the brain power to go through Revelation right now without just pulling on old sermons and stuff. And if you really want that, go online and watch the sermon series we did a few years ago called "It's the End of the World as We Know It." Go take a listen to that. That's that'll cover. So not Revelation, but if you have another New Testament book that you'd like to take a look at, let's go for it. So maybe one of the Gospels might be fun.
We could do Mark. Mark has what I call jerky Jesus, where he's really short with people and he's really mean to the disciples. And Mark would be interesting, but we would love to hear what New Testament book you're reading. Do you want to say a word about the sermon series starting on Sunday since you're preaching it?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say we used to call Mark the Sports Center Gospel because it has just all the highlights and it moves really fast. I got Romans here. Romans could be some real dense theology. That could be interesting.
Chapter 1 would take 4 weeks.
Oh my gosh, Romans would be nuts. Because not only is it really like deep, heavy theology, but it also feels like Paul was on a stream of consciousness roll. So sermon series coming up this Sunday is called Interwoven. And we were kind of talking about 3 weeks that we needed to do before our next sermon series and what would be helpful, and started kind of looking at the ways like I work, live, play, parent, and eat, rest all in the same space. So it's really hard to rest when I have work, and it's really hard to work when I want to parent and play. And so we started talking about like, how can we help people in this situation, and the idea of the Trinity came up in this perfect relationship of how we influence and affect each other. So in this time where we're kind of all on top of each other, we're going to talk about relationships that are interwoven and the way that parents are interwoven with their kids and how that is between the Father and the Son of the Trinity. We're going to talk about kids and how they reflect the glory and how they affect their parents. And then we're going to talk about friends of the Advocate, the Holy Spirit. So we're going to kind of like, you will hear me say often, when I was in seminary, we used to joke that nowhere in our ministry will we ever use the doctrine of the Trinity especially in pastoral care. And we are going to do a whole lot of pastoral care and discipleship in 3 weeks, and we're going to use the doctrine of the Trinity to do it. So anyway,
That's
we're
just
going to
proof that seminary students know nothing. Shout out to
Pretty
all the
much.
seminary students watching this.
That's right. Yeah, if you're a seminary student, come talk to us in 2 years after you graduate. So Steve's mentioning Ephesians here. Anyway, thank you everybody for being here. Keri, Lynn, we hope you enjoy the lakes so much. And we will see everybody on Sunday or next Wednesday night. And we thank you for being here. All right. Bye, everyone.